Pack your things, Victor. Your accounts stay with us, and your commission is void. Julian sneered, sliding the termination papers across the mahogany desk. I stared at him, keeping my expression entirely neutral, while sending a single text message that would destroy this firm by Monday morning. Let us trace this back to the cold reality of numbers. For 22 years, I built the foundation of Vance Wealth Management. I started at this firm in 2004, back when we occupied a cramped, three-room office in downtown Wilmington with drafty windows and a temperamental server that crashed every time the market volatility spiked. I was 26 years old then, fresh out of Wharton, armed with nothing but a clean record, a sharp mind for quantitative analysis, and an appetite for 70-hour workweeks. Richard Vance, the founder, was 50 years old back then, energetic, sharp, and realistic. He knew the business was built on trust, not flashy marketing campaigns or high-end office suites. We shook hands on a simple deal. I build the institutional portfolio division, and I get a direct share of the assets under management I secure and retain. Over the next 2 decades, I did exactly that. By 2026, I was 48 years old, and Vance Wealth Management had grown into a powerhouse, managing $2.1 billion in assets. But here was the crucial detail that the board of directors often glossed over in their quarterly reports. $1.2 billion of those assets belonged to my Keyman portfolio. These were institutional clients, municipal pension funds, and ultra-high net worth family offices that did not sign agreements with Vance Wealth Management because of the logo on the letterhead. They signed because of me. They trusted my risk mitigation strategies, my algorithmic hedging, and my refusal to gamble their capital on volatile tech trends. My crown jewel account was Apex Energy Holdings. They were an independent oil and gas logistics conglomerate with an $800 million portfolio under our management. The managing director of Apex, Roger Hastings, was a no-nonsense industry veteran who valued discretion and consistency above all else. Roger and I had worked together since 2008. We had survived the Great Recession, the oil crash of 2015, and the supply chain crises of the early 2020s. Every quarter, I personally sat down with Roger in a quiet corner of the Union League Club to review their asset allocation, adjusting our yields based on physical commodity flows and municipal bond spreads. For my services, my contract was clear. I received a base salary of $250,000, but the real incentive was the performance commission. Under the 2004 partnership rider, I was entitled to 15% of the management fees and 15% of the performance fees generated by my portfolio. For the fiscal year ending October 2026, my team had delivered a stellar 12% net return for Apex Energy Holdings, generating $120 million in pure profit. The standard contract stipulated a 1.5% management fee on the $800 million AUM, which amounted to $12 million. The performance fee was 20% of the profits, amounting to $24 million. My 15% cut of those fees totaled exactly $5.4 million. It was a massive payout, the largest in the firm's history, and it was scheduled to clear on November 15, 2026. But the corporate landscape at Vance Wealth Management had shifted. Richard Vance was now 70 years old. His health was failing, and his sharp mind was dulled by years of comfortable retirement planning. In 2022, looking to secure his family's legacy, Richard brought in his son, Julian Vance, as the Senior Vice President of Institutional Growth. Julian was 36 years old, possessed a bloated resume from a mid-market retail bank where his primary achievement was overseeing a failed branch expansion program, and wore bespoke Italian suits that could not hide his profound insecurity. Julian viewed my $5.4 million commission not as a earned contract payout, but as a direct leak in his family's balance sheet. From the moment he arrived, he began implementing corporate restructuring initiatives aimed at centralizing client relationships. He wanted to replace personal trust with institutional automation. He replaced our dedicated client portals with cheap, off-the-shelf software and started questioning my travel expenses, even when I was flying to Houston to secure a $50 million Treasury mandate. I watched Julian's maneuvers with quiet detachment, In the wealth management industry, you learn early on that emotional reactions are a liability. If the market drops 200 points, you do not panic. You rebalance. If an arrogant executive tries to undermine your authority, you do not yell. You check your contract clauses. Julian's strategy was obvious. He wanted to sever my direct connection with the key accounts, so that when the November commission deadline arrived, he could claim the portfolio was institutional property and push me out with a minimal severance package. He spent the summer of 2026 hosting private dinners for junior analysts, trying to extract the direct contact numbers and private email addresses of Roger Hastings and the other keyman clients. He even attempted to schedule a private golf outing with Roger, bypassing my office entirely. What Julian failed to comprehend was the absolute loyalty of high-net-worth clients. They do not care about corporate hierarchies. They care about the individual holding the wheel when the weather turns foul. When Julian's assistant called Roger Hastings' office to schedule the golf outing, Roger did not accept. Instead, Roger called my private line within 5 minutes. "Victor," Roger's gravelly voice came through the receiver. "Some kid named Julian Vance is trying to buy me a steak and show me his swing. Who is he, and why is he wasting my time?" "He is the founder's son, Roger," I replied calmly. "He is looking to take a more active role in the firm's institutional relationships." "I don't deal with sons," Roger grunted. "I deal with the man who saved our pension fund from the subprime collapse." "If you are not in the room, my money is not in the room. Remember that." "I do, Roger. I appreciate the loyalty," I said, noting the interaction in my personal log. I knew then that a confrontation was inevitable. Julian's arrogance would not allow him to accept that he was irrelevant to the people who actually funded the firm. He would view Roger's refusal as my insubordination, rather than his own incompetence. I opened my secure personal drive and pulled up the PDF of the Apex Energy Investment Management Agreement. I scrolled down to Clause 14.2, the keyman provision. It was a clause I had insisted on drafting myself back in 2004, when Richard Vance was still reasonable enough to sign it. I read the legal text slowly, confirming every word. The fuse was dry, the match was in Julian's hands. All I had to do was wait for him to strike it. The friction became visible during the second week of October 2026. Julian had called an unscheduled corporate governance meeting, packing the conference room with junior compliance officers and marketing coordinators who owed their recent promotions to him. I sat at the far end of the table, my iPad open to the daily trading spreads, while Julian stood at the whiteboard, presenting his new client integration protocol. "The era of siloed client relationships is over," Julian announced, tapping a marker against a diagram of a centralized database. "From now on, all institutional communication must go through our central CRM. Individual managers will no longer maintain private lines of communication with client representatives. Furthermore, all client entertainment expenses over $500 must be pre-approved by my office 48 hours in advance." I didn't look up from my screen. "Julian, that protocol is unworkable for institutional accounts. When Roger Hastings calls me at 6 in the morning, because the pipeline flows in Cushing are disrupted, and he needs to reallocate $50 million into short-term liquid treasuries, he is not going to wait for a CRM ticket to be routed through your department. And when I host his operations team in Houston, I am not going to ask your permission to buy them dinner." Julian's face flushed. He disliked being corrected, especially by someone who had been at the firm since he was a teenager. "This is a corporate mandate, Victor. It applies to everyone. We are standardizing our operations to reduce risk and cut unnecessary expenses. If Apex Energy cannot adapt to our institutional standards, then perhaps they need to find a boutique firm that accommodates outdated practices." "They have a boutique firm," I said quietly, looking him dead in the eye. "They have me, and I suggest you look at the revenue allocation before you refer to their $800 million portfolio as an unnecessary risk." The room went dead silent. The junior analysts looked down at their notebooks. Julian clenched his marker, his knuckles turning white, but he knew he couldn't win a direct debate on numbers. He dismissed the meeting 5 minutes later, but the look he gave me as I walked out was one of pure malice. The trap was sprung on November 3, 2026. exactly 12 days before my $5.4 million commission was due to be wire transferred. I received an automated calendar invite from Sarah Miller, the Human Resources Director. The subject line was a generic corporate placeholder: Internal Portfolio Review. When I walked into the 12th floor boardroom, Sarah was sitting at the center of the mahogany table, a thick blue folder resting in front of her. Julian Vance was standing by the window, his hands in his pockets, staring out at the gray Wilmington skyline. He didn't turn around when I entered. "Sit down, Victor," Sarah said, her voice flat and rehearsed. I sat down, placing my notebook on the table. "What is this about, Sarah?" She opened the blue folder. "We have completed an audit of your expense reports for the fiscal year 2025 and 2026. The compliance department has flagged multiple discrepancies, specifically a dinner in Houston on August 14 of this year, totaling $4,580, which you billed to the firm. Our records indicate this dinner included individuals who are not registered officers of Apex Energy Holdings." "They were the field operations directors," I replied calmly. "The men who actually manage the logistics pipelines. Building relationships with them is the reason Roger Hastings trusts us with their treasury management." The expense was approved by Richard Vance 3 weeks later. Richard Vance was not in possession of the full audit data. Julian interjected, turning around from the window. His voice was dripping with manufactured authority. "We also have records of you using the corporate travel portal to book a flight to Austin last month that did not result in any documented client meetings. We view this as a misappropriation of corporate funds. Combined with your repeated refusal to implement the CRM integration protocol, the executive committee has determined that you are in material breach of your employment agreement." I looked at the folder, then at Julian. The scheme was so transparent it was almost insulting. They had spent weeks digging through years of expense reports, looking for standard institutional entertainment costs that they could reframe as policy violations. "So," I said, my voice steady, "what is the proposal?" Sarah slid a document across the table. "This is an agreement of immediate separation for cause. Under the terms of your contract, a termination for cause due to financial misconduct results in the immediate forfeiture of all outstanding bonuses, commissions, and deferred compensation. You will receive no severance, and your health benefits will terminate at the end of the month." Julian smiled, a smug, satisfied expression. "We are prepared to offer you a $10,000 transition stipend if you sign this waiver releasing the firm from all future liabilities. If you refuse to sign, we will terminate you anyway, withhold the commission, and file a public lawsuit against you for breach of fiduciary duty. It will ruin your reputation in the industry. No wealth management firm will touch a portfolio manager who has been sued for stealing corporate funds." I looked down at the document. The title read, "Voluntary Resignation and Release of Claims." If I signed this, I would walk away with nothing, admitting guilt to a fabricated charge and giving up my $5.4 million. If I refused, they would fire me, drag me through court, and tie up my commission in litigation for years while they tried to absorb my clients. I picked up my Mont Blanc pen. Julian's eyes widened slightly, expecting me to sign. Instead, I drew a thick black line through the words "voluntary resignation" and wrote "notice of involuntary termination without cause" at the top of the page. I signed my name at the bottom, dating it November 3, 2026. I stood up and slid the paper back to Sarah. "I acknowledge that you are terminating my employment today. I do not agree to the terms, I do not waive my commissions, and I do not admit to any policy violations. You are firing me without cause to avoid paying my contractual commission." Julian's smirk vanished. "You can't just write on the document, Victor. This is a legal termination. We will tie you up in court until you are bankrupt. Your client accounts belong to Vance Wealth Management, and we will contact Roger Hastings this afternoon to let him know you were let go for unethical conduct." "You do what you think is necessary, Julian," I said, picking up my iPad. "And I will do what is necessary." I walked back to my office, under the watchful eye of a security guard Julian had hired to escort me. I packed my personal files, my desk clock, and a framed photograph of my first trade into a single cardboard box. As I walked out of the glass lobby of Vance Wealth Management, the cold autumn wind hit my face. I didn't feel angry. I felt a cold, analytical focus. The market had just moved and it was time to execute the trade. An hour after being escorted from the building, I was sitting in the office of Diana Albright, my legal counsel. Diana was a sharp, 50-year-old contract specialist who had spent 20 years representing senior executives in the Delaware financial sector. She had a reputation for finding the structural flaws in corporate agreements that other lawyers missed. She was currently reviewing the altered separation document I had signed, along with my original 2004 employment contract. "They really didn't think this through, Victor," Diana said, adjusting her glasses as she laid the documents on her desk. "Julian is playing checkers, and he thinks he's playing chess. By physically locking you out of the systems, terminating your corporate access, and escorting you from the premises, they have executed an involuntary termination. Because you wrote notice of involuntary termination without cause and refused to sign their waiver, they have triggered the default provisions of your 2004 contract." "Which means?" I asked. "Which means two things," Diana explained, tapping a finger on the page. "First, under Section 9 of your employment agreement, a termination without cause automatically voids your non-compete covenant. You are free to contact any client, work for any competitor, or start your own firm immediately. Second, and more importantly, it triggers the key man provisions in the investment management agreements of your portfolio clients." She pulled up the Apex Energy Holdings contract, which I had kept in my personal secure cloud storage. She scrolled to page 24, pointing to a highlighted section. "Clause 14.2, she read aloud. "In the event that Victor Thorne ceases to be the designated lead portfolio manager for the account, for any reason, the client shall have the unilateral right to terminate this agreement immediately upon written notice. Upon such termination, all assets under management shall be transferred to a custodian designated by the client within 48 hours, and all management fees, performance fees, and exit penalties shall be waived." Diana looked up, a cold smile playing on her lips. "If Apex invokes this clause, they can pull their entire $800 million portfolio without paying Vance Wealth Management a single cent in termination fees. Normally, an early withdrawal would incur a 2.5% exit penalty, which would be $20 million. But because they fired you, that penalty is zero." "And what about the other accounts?" I asked. "I checked the agreements for the Delaware City Municipal Pension Fund and the DuPont Family Office," Diana replied. "They both contain the exact same keyman rider. Combined with Apex, that is $1.2 billion in assets under management. If they all pull out, Vance Wealth Management loses nearly 60% of its total asset base overnight." "Let's schedule a meeting with Roger Hastings," I said. 2 hours later, I was sitting in the private library of the Union League Club. Roger Hastings was already there, drinking a black coffee and reading the Wall Street Journal. He looked up as I approached, his brow furrowing. "I heard, Victor," Roger said, gesturing for me to sit. "My secretary got a call from Julian Vance's office. He tried to tell her that you were let go for compliance irregularities. I told her to tell him to go jump in the Delaware River." "What the hell happened?" "Julian wants to keep my $5.4 million commission, Roger," I said calmly. "He fabricated an expense report violation to terminate me for cause, hoping I would sign a waiver and leave the clients behind." Roger set his coffee cup down with a sharp clink. "That arrogant little idiot. He thinks he can steal from the man who managed our capital through the 2008 crash? Richard must be losing his mind to let his son run the firm into a ditch. What is our play?" "I am launching my own independent wealth management firm, Thorne Capital," I said. "It will take approximately 2 weeks to finalize the SEC registration, but I have already secured temporary custodial and clearing services through BNY Mellon. If you want to keep your money safe from Julian's management, you need to invoke Clause 14.2 of our agreement." Roger leaned back in his leather chair, a grim smile appearing on his face. "Clause 14.2, the Keyman Clause. I remember when we put that in. Richard didn't want to sign it, but I told him I wouldn't give him a dime without it. If you sign the termination notice, Apex will pull the entire $800 million portfolio from Vance. I explained. The assets will be transferred directly to our BNY Mellon custody account. Vance will lose the management fees, the performance fees, and they will receive 0 exit penalties. Where is the paper? Roger asked. Diana is drafting the formal notices right now, I said. We will have them ready by Monday morning. I am also contacting the trustees of the Delaware City Municipal Pension Fund and the DuPont Family Office. They have the same keyman clause, and they will follow my lead. Sign me up, Victor, Roger said, standing up to shake my hand. I don't invest in logos. I invest in people. Let's show this kid how real business is done. Over the weekend, I worked out of Diana's conference room, contacting the representatives of my other key accounts. The response was unanimous. They were outraged by the firm's behavior and had 0 trust in Julian's ability to manage their funds. By Sunday night, we had signed termination notices from clients representing $1.2 billion in assets. Deanna Albright sat at the head of the table, organizing the signed documents into neat stacks. Each notice cited Clause 14, 2, demanding the immediate transfer of all funds to the BNY Mellon custodial accounts within 48 hours, starting Monday morning at 9 o'clock. The notices will be hand-delivered to the Vance Wealth Management Executive Suite at 9:00 a.m. tomorrow, Diana said, sealing the envelopes. Julian thinks he saved $5.4 million. By tomorrow afternoon, he will realize he just cost his family's firm $12 million in annual management fees and 60% of their business value. It's a margin call he can't pay. I looked out the window at the city lights. In finance, momentum is everything. Julian had pushed me out, thinking he had the leverage of a major corporation behind him. But he had forgotten that a corporation is just a collection of contracts, and I had just cut the cord that held them together. Monday morning at 9:00 a.m. was unusually quiet in the executive suite of Vance Wealth Management. Julian Vance was likely sitting in his office, admiring his new CRM dashboard and preparing to assign my former clients to his hand-picked junior analysts. But at 9:15 a.m., the quiet was shattered by the arrival of 3 independent couriers, each bearing a certified legal folder from Diana Albright's office. At the same time, in the back-office operations department on the 8th floor, the portfolio management systems began to flag a series of massive, automated outbound transfer requests. The custodial clearing platform, which handled our transactions with JP Morgan and BNY Mellon, began generating red alerts on the terminals. I was sitting in a coffee shop across the street, watching the glass entrance of the building. My phone was on the table, silent. Beside me sat Diana, reviewing the transfer confirmations that were appearing on her laptop in real time. The Apex transfer has just been initiated by BNY Mellon, Diana said, showing me the screen. $800 million is moving from Vance's custody to ours. The Delaware City Pension Fund and the DuPont Family Office have also cleared compliance. That is $1.2 billion in transit. The plumbing is working perfectly. Inside the offices of Vance Wealth Management, the panic was immediate. Julian Vance's CRM dashboard could not stop the systemic hemorrhaging of their assets. By 10:30 a.m., the firm's chief operating officer, a sensible man named David Marcus— no, wait, Marcus is on the forbidden list. Let's rename him Thomas Clark. Let's check. Thomas or Clark are not on the forbidden list. The chief operating officer, a sensible man named Thomas Clark, had run the numbers and realized the catastrophic scope of the situation. Thomas marched directly into Julian's office, bypassing his assistant. Julian, we have a code red. We just received immediate termination notices from Apex Energy, Delaware City Pension, and DuPont. They are evicting their portfolios under the Keyman provision. They are moving $1.2 billion to BNY Mellon. Julian's face went white. He stood up from his leather chair. What do you mean, evicting? They can't do that. They have to pay the early termination fees. That is $25 million in exit penalties. No, they don't, Thomas said, slamming the contracts on Julian's desk. Victor Thorne was terminated. The contracts state that if Victor is no longer the lead portfolio manager, the exit fees are fully waived. They are pulling 60% of our AUM, and we can't charge them a single cent. Call Roger Hastings, Julian yelled. Tell him we are assigning our top team to his account. Tell him we will cut our management fee by 50%. I already called Roger's office, Thomas replied. his voice tense. His assistant said that Roger has no interest in speaking with anyone at Vance. She said all communication regarding the Apex portfolio must go through Victor Thorne, who is now their designated advisor. The situation grew worse. Vance Wealth Management had a $40 million revolving line of credit with J.P. Morgan, which they had used to fund their recent office expansion and the high-end marketing campaign Julian had championed. The credit agreement contained a strict covenant. If the firm's total assets under management fell below $1.8 billion, the bank had the right to declare a technical default, freeze the credit line, and demand immediate repayment of the outstanding balance. With my portfolio gone, Vance's AUM plummeted from $2.1 billion to just $900 million. They were $900 million below the covenant threshold. By noon, the senior credit risk officer at J.P. Morgan had already emailed Richard Vance, requesting an emergency call to discuss the covenant violation. Richard Vance, despite his failing health, rushed to the office. When he entered the executive floor, his face was red with anger. He walked straight past Julian's office and into the boardroom, demanding that Julian and Sarah Smiller meet him immediately. "What did you do?" Richard roared, slamming his cane against the boardroom table. "J. Morgan is calling our debt. We don't have $40 million in liquid capital to pay them back. If they freeze our accounts, we are bankrupt by the end of the month." "Dad, it was a compliance issue," Julian stammered, sweating through his bespoke suit. "Victor was misappropriating funds. We had to fire him to protect the firm's integrity." "Misappropriating funds?" Richard sneered. "For a $4,000 dinner? You fired the man who managed 60% of our assets over a client dinner, and you didn't even check the keyman clauses? You didn't realize that the clients belonged to him, not to this name on the door." "We can sue him," Sarah Miller suggested, her voice shaking. "We can file an injunction to block the asset transfer." "On what grounds, Sarah?" Richard yelled. "We fired him. He didn't quit. We executed the termination papers. The moment we walked him out, the keyman clause was triggered. Any judge in Delaware will throw our injunction out in 5 minutes, and it will make the front page of the Wall Street Journal. If the public finds out our major clients are fleeing, the remaining 40% of our assets will vanish by Friday." At 1:15 p.m., my phone finally rang. It was Julian's direct number. I let it ring. It went to voicemail. 10 minutes later, I received an email from Julian. The tone was completely different from the arrogant VP who had fired me. Victor T. The email read, "We need to discuss a mutual resolution regarding your separation. There seems to have been a misunderstanding regarding your expense audit. We are prepared to offer a significant severance package and discuss the payout of your commission. Please call me as soon as possible." I forwarded the email to Diana. "What do we do?" "We let them sweat for 3 hours," Diana replied calmly. "In negotiations, the side that is panicking always gives up the most territory. I will reply at 4 o'clock. At exactly 4:00 p.m., Diana sent a formal reply to Julian and Richard Vance. "Dear Mr. Vance," she wrote, "Mr. Thorne has retained our firm to handle all matters related to his termination. We will not discuss this matter over the phone. We are prepared to attend a meeting tomorrow, Tuesday, November 10, at 10:00 a.m. at our offices. Both Richard Vance and Julian Vance must attend in person. If you fail to attend, we will proceed with filing a formal lawsuit in the Delaware Court of Chancery for breach of contract and unpaid wages by 11:00 a.m. Within 5 minutes, Julian replied with a one-word email. "Confirmed." I closed my laptop and stood up. The corporate fortress Julian thought he owned was crumbling, and he was about to sign the surrender papers. The conference room at Albright & Associates was silent as Richard and Julian Vance took their seats. Richard looked every bit of his 70 years, his shoulders slouched, his breathing heavy. Julian sat beside him, his posture stiff, but the arrogant smirk he had worn on Friday was completely gone. His collar was slightly damp with sweat, and he kept adjusting his watch, unable to look me in the eye. Deanna Albright sat at the center of the table, her laptop open, with a stack of legal agreements neatly arranged in front of her. I sat next to her, keeping my expression neutral, my hands resting calmly on the table. "Thank you for coming," Diana began, her voice professional and ice-cold. "Let's be direct. Your firm is currently in technical default on its $40 million revolving line of credit with JP Morgan due to the drop in assets under management below the $1.8 billion threshold. You have approximately 24 days to cure the default before the bank initiates foreclosure proceedings. You also have 12 days before my client's $5.4 million commission becomes legally overdue under Delaware labor law. Richard Vance sighed, placing his hands on his cane. We know the numbers, Diana. What are your client's terms? Julian opened his mouth to speak. We believe a compromise is. Be quiet, Julian, Richard snapped, his voice sharp enough to cut through the room. You have done enough damage. Let the professionals speak. Julian winced and sank back into his chair, his face turning red. Deanna slid a 5-page document across the table. These are the terms for a mutual release and settlement. First, Vance Wealth Management will immediately transfer $5.4 million to Victor Thorne's designated bank account. This is the full, unmodified commission due for the fiscal year ending October 2026. Second, the firm will issue a formal signed retraction of the compliance allegations against Mr. Thorne, confirming that his termination was entirely without cause and that his record is clean. Third, Vance Wealth Management will pay $1.5 million to cover Mr. Thorne's legal fees and the launch expenses of his new firm, Thorne Capital. Richard looked at the document, his eyes scanning the paragraphs. And in exchange, Diana said, Mr. Thorne will sign a standard mutual non-disclosure and non-disparagement agreement. He will also agree to a structured transition protocol, allowing the back-office operations to transfer the $1.2 billion in assets to BNY Mellon custody in an orderly manner, avoiding any market disruption that could impact your remaining clients. That is $7 million. Julian blurted out, unable to contain himself. We can't pay that. That represents our entire operational cash reserve for the quarter. If we pay that, we won't be able to meet our debt obligations to J. Morgan even if we negotiate a covenant waiver. Diana didn't blink. If you do not sign, we will file our complaint in the Delaware Court of Chancery at 11:00 a.m. today. The filing is already drafted. It includes copies of your internal emails, the altered separation agreement, and the client termination notices. Once that file becomes public record, JP Morgan will not negotiate a waiver. They will freeze your assets immediately to protect their collateral. Your remaining clients will panic, and the firm will be liquidated. You have exactly 35 minutes to decide. Richard Vance looked at his son, then at me. For a moment, I saw a flash of the sharp businessman who had hired me 22 years ago. He knew he had no cards left to play. Julian, Richard said quietly, you are stripped of your title as Senior Vice President. Your partnership shares are hereby clawed back by the Executive Committee to cover the losses incurred by your gross negligence. You will vacate your office by 5 o'clock today. Julian stared at his father in disbelief. Dad, you can't do this. I was trying to save us $5 million. You cost us $12 million in annual fees. You ruined our relationship with our largest clients. And you put our family's firm on the brink of bankruptcy. Richard said, his voice flat and devoid of emotion. You are fired, Julian. Get out of the room. Julian stood up, his chair scraping loudly against the floor. He looked at me, his eyes filled with rage, but he said nothing. He turned and walked out of the conference room, slamming the heavy wooden door behind him. Richard Vance turned back to Diana. He picked up his pen and signed the settlement agreement. The wire transfer will be executed within the hour, Richard said, his voice tired. I built this firm for 26 years, Victor. I wanted my son to have a legacy. I didn't realize he would burn it down in 2 weeks. I am sorry it came to this, Richard, I said, speaking for the first time. But I warned you about his restructuring plan. The business is built on trust, not family names. Richard nodded slowly, stood up, and left the room without another word. By 12:30 p.m., Diana confirmed that the wire transfers, totaling $6.9 million, had cleared my bank accounts. The formal retraction letter was signed and filed. 2 weeks later, Thorne Capital opened its doors in a modern, light-filled office overlooking the Christina River. The SEC registration had cleared without a hitch. Roger Hastings and the operations team at Apex Energy Holdings had successfully transferred their $800 million portfolio to our care. The trustees of the Delaware City Pension Fund and the DuPont family office had also finalized their transitions. We opened with $1.2 billion in assets under management on day one. Vance Wealth Management could not survive the shock. Deprived of 60% of their revenue and unable to cure their covenant default, they were forced to negotiate a distressed sale to Wilmington Financial Group, a large regional competitor. The sale valuation was a mere 1.5 times their remaining annual revenue, a fraction of the 4 times multiple they could have commanded a month earlier. The Vance family equity was virtually wiped out, and the firm's brand name was retired. I stood by the window of my new corner office looking at the water below. On my desk sat the framed photograph of my first trade and my Mont Blanc pen. My phone rang. It was Roger Hastings. "Victor." Roger's voice came through. "We just received the first monthly statements from the new BNY Mellon portal. The integration is seamless, and I see we locked in a solid 3% return on the short-term energy bonds." "Everything is running exactly as planned, Roger," I replied with a smile. "Just like the old days." "Better than the old days, Victor." Roger laughed. "Now, let's get back to work." I hung up the phone and looked out at the river. In finance, there are no permanent structures, only the steady flow of capital. The players change, the logos fade, but the numbers never lie.